Lilies, I'm Kelsey Niena, this is the Orange Lily Project, and today with Biblical Interpretation, we're actually going to be biblical interpreting, specifically with John chapter 4, Jesus and the woman at the well. The videos we've been doing in this series so far up until now has been taking a particular topic, doing a deep dive, and having a grand old time so we can apply this knowledge and tools for future use. Because of that, this video is going to be quite a bit different. Instead of taking a topic, we're going to be taking a passage, and we will read it together, and text will be on the screen, and after we read a portion, we will take a step back, apply our biblical interpretation tools to better understand what's going on and how we should understand it, and then we'll go back and read, pull back, interpret, go back and read, pull back, interpret. So if you'll pull out your pew Bibles, let us turn to John chapter 4, verse 1, Jesus and the woman of Samaria. Now, when Jesus learned that the Pharisees had heard that Jesus was making and baptizing more disciples than John, although Jesus himself did not baptize but only his disciples, he left Judea and departed again for Galilee, and he had to pass through Samaria. So he came to a town of Samaria called Sychar, near the field that Jacob had given to his son Joseph. Jacob's well was there, so Jesus, wearied as he was from his journey, was sitting beside the well. It was about the 6th hour. Pause. We've already got a lot to unpack here. One of the things we've been emphasizing in these videos is if we want to understand where we are, we need to see where we came from. So if you turn your Bibles one page backwards into chapter 2 and 3, we see Jesus was just recently in Jerusalem celebrating the Passover, like all good upstanding Jewish men did. And while in Jerusalem, he meets in secret with a Pharisee named Nicodemus, who has all sorts of questions for him. And it's during this conversation with Nicodemus that we get the famous Bible verse, "For God so loved the world, that he gave his only begotten Son, that whoever should believe in him shall not perish, but have eternal life." John 3:16. That conversation. And then after that, Jesus and his disciples go to an area called Aenon near Salim. And Jesus' cousin, John the Baptist, different from the writer of John the Gospel, John the Baptist is baptizing people. And a number of John's disciples are asking him, "Hey, is it okay that Jesus is getting more followers than you? How is that?" And John famously says, "I must decrease for him to increase." He's the voice in the wilderness making way for the Lord and calling other people to be ready. He is stoked that Jesus is doing what he's doing because he, John, has been dedicating his life to preparing the way for Jesus. So those are the things that have just happened when Jesus and the disciples decide to make their way up towards Galilee. Now, interestingly enough, the place of Aenon and Salim, it's not entirely certain where that is. Some archaeologists think it was up here near this river, so it was near the Jordan River, because that's where the water stemmed out. So it's thought that it might have been around this area for some, but Galilee is in the north, and the Judean countryside is down here. Because remember, Northern Kingdom, back when they were split kingdoms, Israel and Judah. We're interested in that because they are no longer in northern southern kingdoms. They're all Israel occupied by Rome. So if it's here and they're supposed to be going to Galilee, then they went completely out of their way to go through Samaria and Sychar. But if they're in the Jordan countryside, it seems they're in this way, but either way, they're going this way, and they're going through Sychar. Another thing we want to quick look into is a little parentheses note in chapter 9. It says, "Jews have no dealings with Samaritans." Now, if you've read this passage before, and I hope you have, because I'd love to, think that the way you understood the passage before and after this would have changed a bit. That's exciting to me. But if you've read it before, you probably heard that the reason this conversation was so tense and weird was because men didn't speak to women and Jews didn't speak to Samaritans. That's true. Let's look at why. So, moving back much further than we think we need to, looking at the timeline first. So, Jewish timeline, but also our unbroken timeline of redemption and grace. We've had the Abrahamic covenant, we've had the Mosaic covenant, and all of this is covered in the Torah or the Pentateuch, so the law, Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy. And once we hit Joshua, they've left the Exodus, they've left the wilderness, and they've entered into the Holy Lands. That's what it's marked by. Now, the Samaritans, they only acknowledge the Torah or the Pentateuch as Holy Scriptures. And thinking about covenants, the Jews were waiting for the Messianic king, the Davidic king. Meanwhile, the Samaritans were waiting for a different type of Messiah, something called the Taheb, which translated to Messiah or teacher. So moving forward, Moses has just died, and they've just entered into the Holy Lands. And we are actually going to use our zoomed in thing. So they've been in the wilderness, past the Dead Sea, they passed through Jericho, walls come tumbling down. And after Jericho, the Israelites move up to this area that will be known as Samaria. And they make camp between two mountains, Mount Ebal and Mount Gerizim. And Joshua leads them in a festival and offering and of curses and blessings. And Mount Ebal is the Mount of curses, and Mount Gerizim is the Mount of blessings. And later on down the road, the Samaritans and the Jews will deviate in certain things, including words in their Torahs. But one of the big differences is when a holy mountain is referenced, where you're supposed to make offerings unto the Lord, the Samaritans put in Mount Gerizim. Because I believe that's where it was. And part of the Samaritan culture believed that when God tells Abraham to sacrifice his son Isaac, they believed that Mount Moriah was Mount Gerizim. Meanwhile, the Jews believed that the hill now known as Mount Zion was Moriah, which is why they built the temple there. So they come up here, and the Israelites have just come into the Holy Lands. They come up here, they have their offerings and festival of curses and blessings. And then they start, expanding and building camps and homes and more permanent spots. And for a while, the Ark of the Covenant and the tabernacle were kept here together. And then Eli, one of the priests, and I think he was a grandson or great-grandson to Aaron, something like that. He was in the line of Levi. He took the Ark of the Covenant, not the tabernacle, but he took the Ark of the Covenant and put it in their temple, in their place of worship. They did not yet have the temple of the Lord yet, but it was a place of worship, and he took it there. And the Samaritans, part of their history and culture, says that Eli stole it, that he wasn't supposed to have it. I'm honestly not sure of that part of the politics, but he definitely wasn't supposed to take only the Ark of the Covenant. The Ark of the Covenant and the tabernacle were supposed to be together. And later on down the road, we see that Eli was not a great father and did not teach his sons how to properly honor the Ark of the Covenant. And they started a tradition of using the Ark of the Covenant as a good luck charm. And eventually that became the practice, and then it was stolen by the Philistines. Point is, part of the Samaritan culture believes that the Jews stole the Ark of the Covenant when it was supposed to be between their two holy mountains, and they were supposed to take care of it. Again, I'm not entirely sure one way or the other, but this is what your great-grandparents did, and we still remember. But Assyria comes from the north and comes down and takes over this area. And one of the things they did was they brought their people and they brought their gods. They had 5 gods that they worshipped, which will come into play later. And the Samaritans notably went with it. They're like, okay, I guess we're worshiping these now as well. And so there came a time where, God was supposed to be their one true God, but they also had these other little gods. So the God they were worshiping was not their one God. It was the next in a line of many. And so when Babylon came and took a bunch of people from Judah and Israel, and they go over here, one of the important things about Jewish purity is you didn't marry outside the religion. We see again and again where someone would marry a woman from a different religion, and she'd bring her gods in, and then the family would be corrupted. And the same happened on a larger scale. The Jews of especially Samaria would marry the Assyrian women and take on those gods, and so suddenly where you were supposed to be purebred, you became half-breeds, and that is what they were eventually called. So when Nehemiah gets permission, so during the Persian occupation, Nehemiah gets permission from King Cyrus the Great to come back and rebuild the temple and the city of Jerusalem. And they come back down. And Samaria, we'll get a bit bigger again. Samaria heard that the temple and the city was being rebuilt, and they were stoked, and they came down offering to help with the construction. And especially the prophet Ezra, they were disgusted that the Samaritans had been marrying outside their religion and were taking on the practices and the worshiping practices of these heathens. And the Jews said, not only can you not help, but you can't worship here either. You are half-breeds, you're dirty, be gone, be gone, be gone. And so the Samaritans went back to the land of Samaria, and because they believed that Mount Gerizim was the mount that God had said to build a temple and worship and not kill Isaac, they built a temple here. And so they had two temples, the Jewish temple in Jerusalem and the Samaritan temple on Mount Gerizim outside of Sychar. And about 150 years before Jesus and the Samaritan woman's conversation, so in 128, I think, BC, a bunch of the Jews went to Mount Gerizim and burned the temple to the ground. So remember the heartbreak and the pain of the Jews losing their first temple. The Samaritans have been thrown out of the kingdom and the temple. They're not welcome, and they've created a place to worship. And the people who said they're not allowed to worship here said you can't worship here either, permanently making them nomads religiously. In synagogues, you didn't do offerings unto the Lord. It was there for worship, but assembly and study. It was more where you would grow in your faith educationally. The temple is where you worshiped, and the temple is where you gave offerings. And we've talked about the offerings. They were only to be done in the tabernacle, and then when the temple came, only at the temple, and then the second temple. These offerings, which were meant to, reconcile you to you and God, they could only be given at the temple in Jerusalem. And so the Jews, by saying, you can't worship in our temple because you're dirty, and you can't have that temple either because we hate you, they were saying, one of the many things they were saying is, you can't be right with God. These can only be done at the temple. We agree with that. And there's no place for you to do it. So the Jews were essentially forever condemning and cursing the Samaritans from ever being able to reconcile with God, which, between the ongoing tensions here of the Jews feeling that they had betrayed their people by intermarrying and bringing in these other religions, and then the Samaritans rightly understanding the destruction of their temple as the Jews effectively saying you can never be right with God. By the time we get to Jesus' time, the tension between Samaritans and Jews was so tense that there was a saying, it's better to walk in a ditch than the shadow of a Samaritan. Back then, when Jesus told the story of a good Samaritan, that would have blown their brains. The only type of good Samaritan in their books was a dead one. This is how much they hated this people. And so only someone who was in the utmost of hurries, had no time to waste, would go straight through. And because of that, you wouldn't be staying long anyway. You would just zip through and then find a nice Jewish town to spend the night, or camp. You would never stay in the town itself. And this Samaritan woman coming up this well by herself to see a rabbinic Jew sitting there, you can imagine that she'd already be feeling very defensive and not ready for anything good to happen.